how's everybody doing? Sorry, it took me a second to get on. I keep forgetting to cut off my mic every time. There you go, got that fixed. How's everybody doing today? Pretty good crowd here. It looks like we've got 6 or 7 people. Good to see you. Welcome to Tuesday. Hi Donnie, how you doing? Alex G, good to see you. Madison Fitz, good to see you. I sent you an email earlier, Madison. Did you get the email that I sent you about the homework? I did fix the problem for you, so if you could take care of that. Hi Erica, good to see you. Kayla, good to see you. Wow, the same old crowd here. It's great to have everybody. Fantastic. So, what I'd like to do today is finish up what I started off yesterday, which was the lecture on IQ testing. I hope everybody can see the screen up here in front of me. Today's lecture outline, we're going to talk a little bit about IQ and genetics and environmental effects. Then we're going to talk a little bit more about evaluating IQ tests. I'm going to go back and revisit that. It's sort of a setup to some differences that we see in IQ tests and what they mean, and what some people, some modern theorists think about the way that intelligence should be measured. So we're going to go ahead and get started. Hopefully I won't keep you too long today. But if you remember, let's just go back as a review yesterday. Remember I told you IQ tests were developed back in the early part of the 20th century by a fellow named Alfred Binet, who was asked by the French Ministry of Education to come up with a way of identifying students who might need more help in school. He came up with this idea of comparing your mental age to your chronological age to give a ratio of your ability compared to your peers. Now I then suggested to you that modern psychology, modern IQ tests now use what we call as the deviation method, where we compare you to people who are the same age to see how well you reason compared to people of the same age. Now, I suggested to you that modern IQ tests don't just give you one number. We typically think of IQ as coming in one number, but I suggested to you that IQ sort of breaks down your functioning abilities into smaller components, such as your ability to comprehend what's being said, the quality of your working memory, and your processing speed. Now, I don't know if you folks remember from a couple of weeks ago, the gentleman Clive Waring with the 7-second memory. Can anybody take a guess what his IQ score might be if he were to take an IQ test? What do you think? Does anybody have a guess? If you would, go ahead and type it in the chat box. And tell me which one of these components you think of his IQ was probably most damaged. Actually, his IQ would be relatively low. In fact, I'll bet you $1 to a donut he would score in the mentally deficient area. He would probably score less than 70. Because if you think about it, you have to be able to remember to search for digits. You have to be able to remember your multiplication tables. You have to have the ability to keep something in your mind to engage in a puzzle. So the weird thing is, you would see a crazy pattern though, Ken. You would probably see that his similarities, his ability to do information tasks, his ability to complete pictures and do puzzles would probably be okay. But anything that required him to think and keep anything in his memory would probably be very, very difficult for him. In fact, in your textbook, they argue that maybe the 2 primary fundamental cognitive skills that underlay IQ are working memory capacity, how big your short-term memory span is, and how quickly your processing speed is. So from an information perspective, some people say that underlying these categories is 2 main things: how fast you can manipulate information and how large your particular RAM is. So I suggested to you that modern IQ tests, they allow us to sort of assess these intellectual abilities by breaking IQ up into component parts. Now, what I want to talk about today is a little bit of some other issues related to IQ tests. Now, IQ tests were invented about the same time that we were experiencing all the social ills that go with the industrialization of America. Remember, I suggested to you that behaviorism was a method of solving this problem. I suggested to you that behaviorists thought that our environment shaped all of these bad behaviors. Well, we can compare them with another group of people called the eugenists. And the eugenists were people who knew a lot about this new science called genetics, and they were farmers and cattle people who knew a lot about breeding and interbreeding of stock. And they believed that there were some human qualities that were inherently genetic. And one of the first things that they questioned was this idea of intellect, because intellect is such a fundamentally important human quality. People quickly wanted to know, was it something you were born with, or was it something you nurtured? And so there were a lot of research studies which tried to prove one way or the other. And actually, what's it called? It'll hit me in a minute. There was actually a controversy from a behavioral geneticist, the Cyril Burt affair. Google that if you want. Cyril, C-Y-R-I-L, B-U-R-T. He was a behavioral geneticist who researched IQ, and it turns out he may have cheated his data. And that's because this idea of whether or not we are born with this fundamentally important quality was a very, very important question. And so a field of study grew up around this and other human qualities we'll call behavioral genetics. And this is just a scientific approach to assessing the impact of genes on a particular trait or behavior. And so what they do is they compare the concordance, or the correlation between two people on a trait, and then they compare that with their genetic similarity. So if you know anything about genes, I know just a little bit. I took a couple of biology classes in college. People who, like you and I, who are not related, have zero genetic similarity. All right? So compare that with people who are siblings, and siblings share basically half of their genetic material. And then you have people who are identical twins, and identical twins share 100% of the genetic material. So what you can do is you can compare those groups of people, compare the correlations of IQ scores. And what you would expect, if genes do influence intelligence, is as we get genetically more similar, what we would expect would be to see a higher correlation among people. So what you're going to notice is that identical twins, raised apart and raised together, show a really high correlation with IQ scores. Siblings that share 50% of their genetic material show a significant correlation on IQ scores, but not nearly as strong as you see with identical twins. And you know what? Adoptive siblings who share zero genetic material show a significant correlation, but it's less strong than the correlation that you would see for people who share genetic material. So what you can do is, using people who are either genetically similar or dissimilar, people who are either raised together or raised separately, you can begin to tease out how much of a particular behavior or quality is due to genetics. And what you're going to see is that there is a high genetic component to IQ scores. So the two upshots from this are adoptive siblings share no genes and have the lowest correlation of IQ scores. Still a little bit of correlation. And identical twins who share 100% genetic material show the highest correlation even when they're reared apart. I'm telling you, it's all in the genes. However, there's plenty of research to suggest that environmental factors do affect intelligence as well. In fact, you'll see here I have a screen showing you the mean IQ scores for children born at different weights. If you remember in chapter 4, we talked about low birth weight and premature birth as being associated with intellectual functioning. And here it is. What you're going to see is that the more the baby weighs, that is, the closer the baby comes to full term generally, the higher the IQ is going to be on average. And that's because this environmental forces, this prenatal development is allowed to continue, is better for these children who make it to full birth weight as opposed to children who are born at 4 and 5 pounds of weight. You know what? Turns out breastfeeding is associated with IQ scores, and exposure to lead paint is negatively correlated with IQ scores. So there are environmental factors that can affect your IQ score. Probably the best way to think about it, though, is to think of you as having a genetically set IQ point. All right? Maybe 115, maybe 85, maybe whatever. And then your environment can affect that overall IQ score to a certain degree. So maybe your genetic set point was 115, but if I brought you up in an incredibly diverse and stimulating environment, your IQ might spin up to 120. But on the other hand, let's say you grew up in a neglected environment, your IQ might still turn out to be 105, right? And we would say the range about that genetic set point is what we would call a reaction range. Now, some genetic traits are not affected by the environment. Think about your eye color. You're born with your eye color. You're either blue or brown or green or whatnot. Your IQ is set to a certain extent, but your environment can affect it just a little bit. I hope that makes sense, right? So there's a long tradition in IQ research with behavioral genetics. And in fact, the application of behavioral genetics to IQ scores was one of the fundamental driving forces in the eugenics movement. Are all of you familiar with the eugenics movement? This policy of selectively sterilizing people deemed unfit for reproduction. A lot of times the forced sterilization was based on cultural factors, IQ tests, or ethnicity, without regards to the rights of the person. And in fact, I think people were euthanized, were forcibly sterilized up until the 1970s here in North Carolina. And if you did poorly on an IQ test and got in some trouble, that could be an outcome for you here in the United States in the 20th century. Any questions so far? Yes, do you have a question, Erica? If you do, please feel free to ask it. Meanwhile, I'm going to go on with my lecture until you finish typing your question in. Now, here's the deal. IQ tests hold a lot of power in our society. An IQ test can fundamentally change your educational path in school. If you score well enough, the school's going to throw extra money stimulating and helping you develop your brain. But if you score poorly enough on an IQ test, a school may underestimate your potential and put you in these classes that don't challenge you. So your school can fundamentally change your educational outcomes based on an IQ test. If you're in a court case, you know what? IQ tests can be used to fundamentally affect your legal standing in court, whether or not you are in control of your money, your resources, whether or not you go to jail, you get the death penalty. And they definitely affect, oh my goodness, I used an E instead of an A. They affect hiring and clinical site decisions. So your freedom may be based on your IQ scores. Man, these tests are huge in their importance. And so it's very important that these tests accurately measure what it is we say they measure. And the people who are in charge of that are known as psychometricians. And they make sure that these important tests are both reliable and valid. Okay, two very important qualities for a measurement tool. So just like you want a bathroom scale to give you the same measurement every time you measure the same thing, right? If you jump on it 5 times, you want it to give you the same weight every time. That's reliability. And you also want your test to measure it, what exactly it is it says it's measuring. So for example, if you jumped on your bathroom scale and it said 5'2", you would be a little bit surprised, right? Because it's not measuring what it's supposed to be measuring. Now that seems silly and obvious for a bathroom scale, but when you're making a test to measure a mental quality, you have to make sure that you're measuring weight and not height when you say you're measuring weight and not height. Does that make sense? So we're interested in both the reliability and the validity of these items. And so you'd have to become a psychometrician. Not to brag, but UNC Chapel Hill has one of the few psychometric labs in the United States where you can actually go and get your psychometrician PhD. It's a cool program. Check it out if you find IQ and personality tests interesting. So let's talk about reliability and validity. Reliability is the degree to which the measurement tool gives you the same measurement each time you measure the same thing. So if you use a measuring tape, you should get the same measurement in length every time you measure your kitchen table, unless your kitchen table changes, of course. Every time you measure yourself, unless you gained or lost weight, your bathroom scale should give you the same measurement each time. That's what we call reliability. And IQ tests can also be evaluated for their reliability. And it turns out that IQ tests are extremely reliable. Whatever it's measuring, now I'm not going to say that IQ is necessarily measuring all of intelligence or even any of intelligence, but whatever it is measuring, it reliably measures beginning at the age of 4. That is to say, if you're in the 65th percentile for IQ at the age of 4, guess what? You're probably going to be in the 65th percentile for IQ at age 24 and 44 and 74. Just like if you folks remember taking your children or going to the pediatrician when you were kids or had kids, and they would track your kid's head size and your kid's height and your kid's weight in terms of percentile. And they can pretty much tell you at age 4 or 5 about how tall your kid's going to be. The same way, IQ tests are just that reliable. So I've got a check mark. IQ tests, pretty stinking reliable. The question with IQ tests is, do they actually measure in intelligence? And there are some reasons and some things that occur that make us wonder whether or not we are really measuring IQ. Now, you probably never thought about the concept of validity before, but there are many different ways to talk about validity. You can talk about face validity, predictive validity, content or construct validity. And so you can talk about all these ways in which a test is valid. Now, IQ tests have a lot of what we would call face validity. When people look at an IQ test, they go, wow, it's got math and it's got vocabulary questions. That sure does look like an IQ test. Okay, and so we would say that IQ tests have a pretty good amount of face validity. Now, do they have predictive validity? If you don't know exactly what you're measuring, so let's say we're measuring intelligence. Does my test really measure intelligence? Well, one way to assess that is to see if it predicts your performance in a setting that requires intelligence, right? So if my test measures intelligence, it ought to tell me who's going to be good in a setting that requires intelligence. Turns out IQ tests are pretty good at being predictive of school performance. All right, kids who score IQs of 70 are not going to have nearly as much success as kids who score IQs of 100 or 115, right? And in fact, this is one of the diagnostic tools that we use to diagnose a learning disorder. If you're having trouble with math and you can't seem to figure out your mathematical computations, but your IQ is 110, we know you have a learning disorder, because with an IQ of 110, you should be able to be successful in school. And so one of the things that they say about a learning disorder is it's a specific, narrow school difficulty that occurs in a person with otherwise normal intelligence. So if you're having trouble in math class and you can't do what the other fourth graders can do, but your IQ is pretty high, we begin to suspect that you have some sort of math disorder. And that's because IQ tests are really predictive of school performance. Now, are they predictive of job performance and adult success? The link here is a little bit fishier because a lot of factors really do play into your adult success. Your ability to control your emotions, your ability to control your impulses, your sociability, your extroversion. There are a ton of other factors that really play into whether or not you become a success as an adult. And IQ tests don't necessarily capture those things. Which leads to the question, if IQ tests don't capture that, then do they really fundamentally capture what it means to be intelligent? Because intelligence is whatever allows you to successfully navigate your environment, right? Whatever allows you to navigate the maze and find your cheese. And then another problem that we will see with IQ tests that makes us question their validity is that they show this difference between ethnic groups. And we really, if this test really does measure neurological computational power, then does it make sense that it should show ethnic differences? Now, the test was created in one particular culture. So did that culture design a test which works with and is endemic to the way that culture reasons and functions? So there are people who question, if we have these ethnic differences in IQ tests or this cultural bias, then should we really believe that these tests really measure human functioning? Good point, Erica. I would say no too. And so we're going to talk a little bit about that before we get done. Okay, let's first talk about this idea of cultural bias. Can a test show ethnic differences? So right here you're going to see the distribution of IQ scores on a given on an IQ test, and this is pretty standard, pretty common, and a pretty long-standing difference that you will see. These differences have been observed since the creation of IQ tests. And what you're going to see is that your Asians and whites typically are going to have higher average IQ scores than our Hispanics or African American students. Now, here's the thing. There are a ton of really smart African Americans and Hispanics, and there are a ton of really unintelligent Asians and whites. And you can see the extremes overlap both ways. But in terms of the average distributions, you're going to see about 10 to 15 points between your European and Asian groups and your Hispanic and African American groups. And the question is, what exactly does that represent? You might immediately say, well, clearly it shows that there are intellectual functioning differences. Check this out. When they made the first IQ tests, there were questions that showed gender differences. Females scored higher on these questions than did males. And so they threw out all the questions that showed gender differences on IQ tests. But they didn't throw out the questions that showed ethnic differences on IQ tests. And in fact, some of the questions might ask you, which instrument do you need a reed for? And unless you're familiar with musical instruments, you may be a super smart person but not know that bit of cultural knowledge. So, we can conclude one of two things from these ethnic differences. These differences do exist. I'm sorry, folks, these are the numbers. Now, there are two reasons. Either there are fundamental human differences, and I got a there, because I would say that doesn't seem to hold water to me, right? Okay, we all have the same blood, we all have the same organs, etc., etc. Or maybe the tests are biased. And it turns out that the most biased parts of IQ tests tend to be the parts that rely on verbal reasoning, questions, comprehension items, things that use language. IQ tests have a verbal section and a nonverbal section. And you're going to see a much bigger differences in the verbal sections than you will see in the nonverbal sections of IQ tests. So maybe the tests are biased. At any rate, it makes us feel less comfortable relying on these particular tests. Now, there are people who suggest that maybe the reason we see these ethnic differences is because we have such a long-standing history of debasing African American and minority people in this country. And you know what? Stereotypes are generalizations about groups of people. And people have negative and positive stereotypes about their own group. So just like I may have certain biased beliefs about African Americans, you as an African American have these same knowledge structures. You know these things. We all know what these stereotypes are. And there are some people who say that sometimes when we're put into a setting in which our particular ethnicity is not supposed to perform well, that we get uptight and nervous about confirming the negative stereotype. So in a very famous study, what they did was they gave African American and white students an SAT test, and they told them in one condition it was a test of intelligence, and it was very diagnostic of their intellectual ability. And you see that there's a big difference between the African American and the white students. In the second condition, they told them that it was just a problem-solving test. It is not a diagnostic test for diagnosing intelligence. And what you'll see is that the difference between these two groups almost completely goes away. So the idea might suggest that really these differences we see is because in our society we have expectations about how people are going to do on these tests. Now, research has shown that now that you are familiar with this, my students, if you happen to be in a group which may be threatened by this particular stereotype, as long as you are aware of this, you can fundamentally work through this problem and begin to overcome this limitation that's put in front of you, sort of like knowledge is power, if you will. Any questions so far? Now, if IQ tests are biased, if we have a question with their validity, if they're not so good at telling us who's going to do well in the workplace, what is their utility? Maybe we should think about other approaches to conceptualizing an intelligence. Remember, intelligence tests were actually created before people started developing theories, large grand theories of what intelligence was. So, my friend the clinical psychologist who gives IQ tests for a living, if you want to hear a joke, you ask him, "Hey Dave, what's intelligence?" He's like, "Intelligence is what an intelligence test measures." The crazy thing is they built the test and then somebody said, "Hey, that's intelligence." We don't do science that way. Usually we conceptualize the thing that we're interested in measuring, and then we see if our research can confirm this thing that we've developed. But IQ tests were developed backwards. Somebody developed the test, Alfred Binet developed the test, and somebody said, "Hey, that measures intelligence." So, your book's going to talk a little bit about other theorists who have suggested maybe we ought to expand the way we think about IQ tests. And your book talks about three theories: the theory of multiple intelligences, the theory of triarchic intelligence, and the emotional intelligence theory. Now, fluid and crystallized intelligence isn't a new intelligence theory per se, it's just a different way of looking at the items on an IQ test. Some items on an IQ test represent facts and knowledge. Let's call those crystallized intelligence. Other items on the IQ test ask for you to reason or think critically or creatively or solve problems. Let's call that fluid intelligence, all right? Now, why is this important, Chris? Well, people have done longitudinal research to discover how intelligence changes as we get older. If you've got a 95-year-old grandparent, you know they're not as sharp as they used to be. My 80-year-old dad's not as sharp as he used to be. But how exactly does your intellect change as you get older? A very famous longitudinal study called the Seattle Longitudinal Study looked at how IQ scores changed as people got older. And they looked at fluid IQ abilities and crystallized IQ abilities. And it turns out that as you go through middle and late adulthood, your 50s and 60s, your crystallized intelligence doesn't change that much. You seem to know what you know. What slows down is your fluid intelligence, your problem solving, your critical thinking, your creative thinking abilities. They seem to start trending down in your 50s. KB, you and I are not going to write the next great novel or create the next great rock and roll album, man. Our creative juices, our creative days are behind us, so to speak. And your fluid intelligence is what changes and decreases as you get older. And a lot of this is thought to be underlaid by our slow down processing. We don't think as fast when we get older. Now, you can't really teach old dogs creative tricks, KB. I'm sorry. You and I are just going to continue to bark at the milk truck when it comes by, buddy. Now, so fluid and crystallized intelligence isn't a new theory, but it's a way of looking at scores or the different categories on an IQ test. Now, the other theories are actually theories which seek to fix what are thought to be theoretical problems in the testing of IQ. So I'll start with the triarchic theory. And this guy, Robert Sternberg, says that IQ tests measure analytical intelligence, which is your problem-solving, puzzling, and information processing abilities. But he argues that it misses two very important qualities of human functioning: creativity and practical knowledge, or what we might call common sense, right? How many of you know a person who is super duper creative, makes amazing paintings, writes amazing poems, can write cool songs? You know what? That's a form of human functioning. Just because it doesn't fit into a checkbox on a school exam does not mean that creativity is not a form of human intellect. So Sternberg puts that into the model, and also what we might call practical knowledge. How smart you are in functioning in your world. How many of you know somebody that has tons of book smarts but no street smarts? Anybody know a person like that? Right? And then on the other hand, how many of you know somebody who doesn't have a bit of education, but they just seem to know how the streets work and they seem to get things done? That's what we might call your practical intelligence. You know what the problem with the triarchic theory of intelligence is? We don't have a validated test. Oh, swing and a miss. It's a great theory, but if you don't have a test, you don't have a dog in the race, so to speak, right? Now, a better theory, I think an even more complete theory, is offered by Howard Gardner. He wrote a book called Frames of Mind, and he argued that we have not only 3, but we have 8 forms of intellectual ability. And in fact, he took this modular approach. I don't know if you remember chapter 3, we talked about modular function of the brain. He argued that if you can localize an intellectual ability that shows a developmental trajectory and helps people be successful in life, then that is a form of intelligence. And he came up with 8 different forms of intelligence that I probably won't ask you about on the exam, but I just want you to think broadly about this. He argues that, you know what, we have mathematical and logic. IQ tests measure mathematical or logical and linguistic and spatial intelligence. They measure those. He argues, though, however, we have musical knowledge too. There are musical savants that can hear and play music, that can write amazing songs and melodies. Think of Beethoven and Bach. And that's a form of intelligence as well, because we actually have a part in our brain near the acoustic center that's responsible for processing melody, right? And then there's what we might call bodily kinesthetic. If you've ever seen an amazing artist paint or draw, or Michael Jordan dunk, or a ballet person do their spins around, you know that being able to control your body is a form of intellectual functioning. And then finally, Sternberg, but Gardner says we need to think about what he calls the personal intelligences. Intrapersonal is your ability to control your emotions. How many of you have a friend that loses their cool and gets angry at work? If you lose your emotional cool, you never get ahead at work, correct? And then, how many of you know somebody who is a good schmoozer? If you have a friend who is a good schmoozer, they are high in what Gardner would call interpersonal intelligence. That's knowing how to read and respond to other people's nonverbals, right? And in fact, you might argue that really the key to success is not necessarily being smart, but knowing how to work people. And that's where Salovey and Meyer's emotional intelligence theory comes in. They argue that we shouldn't think about IQ, we should think about EQ, which is your ability to control your emotions and respond effectively in social situations. So according to Salovey and Meyer, we wouldn't even care if you could do a math equation or knew what a porcupine was, as long as you were good at working around and manipulating other people successfully. Now, what's the problem with the theory of multiple intelligence and EQ? They don't have validated tests either. So here's what I'll tell you. You can either have a flawed theory of IQ, which shows cultural biases which may impair its validity, which may only be useful in educational settings, or would you like to have a broader theory of what intellectual functioning is about, but not have a useful test to support it? That sort of seems to be where we are with IQ testing right now. And the bottom line, the bottom note for those of you who are living in a world where you deal with IQ tests, remember the IQ test is an important diagnostic tool, but it is not a fundamental indicator of your worth, of your child's worth, of anything. It is simply one way of measuring a way in which humans function. And instead it depends upon your ability to work well, control your impulses, and manage your emotional functioning. Any questions? That's all I really have to say for today. Thank you again for coming. Tomorrow we're going to be talking about motivation, and then we're going to wind up Thursday by talking about emotion, the brain areas involved in emotion, and different theories on how emotions arise. If you don't have any questions, I'll say good day, and I look forward to seeing you tomorrow.
Your call cannot be completed as dialed. Please consult your directory and call again, or ask your operator for assistance. This is a recording.